I think we're ready to go. So I would like to introduce Mr. Bruce Hallman, who is, as you know, is an island historian. He's written a lot of articles and a book or two on the history of Vashon Island. We are just totally thrilled to have him here, and he's going to be talking about the census and the history of the census on Vashon Island, as well as some of the implications for today. As everybody knows, April 1st was Census Day in the United States. And so it's something on all of our minds, and especially those of us who benefit from allocations from the federal government based on our count. So listen up, and as I say, there'll be opportunity for questions at the end and maybe even as we go along. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Bruce.
Good. Thank you, Liz. The idea for this talk is the result of the Senior Center and the Vashon Heritage Museum thinking about doing monthly history talks for the Senior Center. We've been doing them for almost 3 years in an informal way, but we thought about trying to make it a more formal relationship between the Senior Center and the Heritage Museum. And this one was scheduled for this Friday in April, and then this coronavirus pandemic came along. And we thought rather than canceling it, we would try and move it into this online virtual format just to see how it works. So this is an experiment. And as Liz said earlier, please let us know how it works or not works or what could be better. Again, this is, as Liz said, this is our maiden voyage. So this is the first time through. Okay, so what I want to do today is talk about the census on Vashon. And these two pictures, to me, really capture sort of what we see with the Vashon census. The picture on the top is taken in the 1910s, but is really reflective of Vashon from the 1880s into the 1920s, and even into the 1930s, where it's largely an agricultural farming community. It's largely family-based. There's a number of single young men on the island who are working in agriculture and logging and fishing and other resource extraction industries. But it's a fairly simple, small town, rural environment. The bottom picture is of the rowing club at Jensen Point, and is a good reflection of who we are today. It's primarily all white people. It's a mixed age group, but slightly older than younger. And it really is a reflection of who we are. And when you look at the two pictures, you get a sense of some of the changes that have taken place on Vashon. So let me run through a little bit of just a general history of census and why censuses are taken. The very first known census, and what you see there in the image is a cuneiform tablet from the Babylonian Empire. The first known census was taken 3,800 years BCE, which means before current era. And that's kind of a recognition. We used to use BC AD, before Christ, ante domino. BCE sort of uses the same start point, but it's sort of less religious based and less Western culture based. And it talks about before current era. So that means 3,800 years before the birth of Christ. And essentially what the Babylonians wanted to do was they wanted to know how many people there were, but also how many goats and how many sheep, and how many cows. And I mean, because what they wanted to do was they wanted to tax people. So censuses have always been based on the idea of knowing who the population was, but also knowing so that governments had the opportunity to tax. The oldest known surviving data from a census is in the 2nd century current era, from the Han dynasty in China, and it recorded 57.7 million people in China at the time. Now, we're all familiar with censuses from the 6th century current era, the Roman census in Judea, And I'm going to read just a little excerpt from the King James Bible, just because I love the language of the King James Bible, but it's where most people know about censuses. And the passage goes, "And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria, and all went to be taxed, everyone into his own city. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth, into Judea, into the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child. And so it was that while they were there, the days were accomplished that she should be delivered. And she brought forth her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn." So that sort of basic Christian story of the birth of Christ is based in taxes and based in the census. So a long sort of history of censuses. For the sort of English world, the world based in Britain and the British settler societies that spread around the world into Canada, the United States, and Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, and other places. You look back to the 1086 current era Doomsday Book, which was right after the Norman invasion. And what the French Norman wanted to do when they came into England and took control is they wanted to identify all the landholders and what kind of property they have, again, so they could tax. And so what you see is an excerpt from, for Bedfordshire, of the Doomsday Book. And every landowner was identified and his property was identified. And again, the purposes of taxing. The first modern census, which was done to get information on populations, and this really is a product of the Enlightenment, and sort of the idea of rational science coming in. So based on more than just wanting to tax, wanting to know who the population was and sort of the beginning of demography as a science begins in 1703, was the first modern census in Iceland. And they counted 50,366 people. And what you see there is one of the pages from that. They visited every farm in Iceland except one. They missed one farm. But except for that, they counted everybody in Iceland. And it was not only to get a sense of who was there and who had property, but what ages they were, what gender they were. So the first sort of attempt to look at census data as more than just a collection of taxes. And then we move to sort of modern era. I just love this photograph. That's the UNIVAC 1 Remington Rand computer. But in 1890, the US Census was the first census to use electric tabulating machines, calculators. And then in 1950, actually UNIVAC was developed by Remington Rand as a method for the US Census to count the 1950 census. And so sort of the birth of the computer age, in a sense, has a link to the concept of taking censuses. So that's a general sort of overview. Now I want to talk next about American census, and then we'll talk more distinctly about Vashon census. So Liz, at this point, any questions? Nobody's raised their hand?
Well, does anyone have any questions? You want to raise your hand, or I don't have any in the chat box, but if somebody wants to raise their hand, we could maybe include you at this point. I have a question. How many people were counted in China in what year?
57.7 million. And that was, I don't know how I can go back with, there we go. 2nd century, current era. So 57 million people in China at that time.
Wow.
So why we do censuses in the United States and when they begin is based in our Constitution. So 1789, Article 1, Section 2. And I want to read through this with you and sort of deconstruct it, because there's a lot of I think, interesting kinds of things in here. So This Article 1, Section 2, representatives, and meaning the House of Representatives, because the great compromise, one of the great compromises in the American Constitution was to have every state have 2 senators and then House of Representative members apportioned by population. Well, how do you make that determination? You got to count the population. So that's the impetus for the first census. So representatives, House of Representative members, and direct taxes. So at this point, the federal government is taxing states, not taxing individuals. That begins to change into the 20th century. But at this point in 1789, appointing representatives or sort of apportioning representatives and apportioning taxes shall be apportioned among the several states. And this is an interesting phase, which may be included within this union. In other words, they had the concept early on that the union would grow. So it included states that would come into the union. So may be included within this union. According to the respective numbers, so based on the count of a census, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons. So they count the number of free persons, which at that point meant white people, including those bound to service for a term of years. So that means those who were indentured servants, who had come into the United States or had sold themselves into a term of servitude, usually 3 to 5 years, and then they would become free persons. And excluding Indians not taxed. And again, this is, as you deconstruct this, excluding Indians. Indians were not considered American citizens until the 1930s. And then 1920s. And then Indians who were not taxed were not considered citizens, whereas some Native Americans had moved off of reservations, had broken ties with their tribal group, had moved out into the dominant society and had become part of that society and were paying taxes. So they wanted to distinguish between Indians who were still in tribal societies and on reservations and those who had left and were out and paying taxes. So excluding Indians who are not taxed, and that's sort of a larger sort of sense of how the American government has treated Indians. And then this is a fascinating phrase, 3/5 of all other persons. Well, who are all other persons? Slaves. So it's a kind of euphemism. It's a kind of use of language rather than to identify slaves directly. What they do is say 3/5 of all other persons. Now that changes after the Civil War with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. But up until that time, slaves were not counted as full people in the census. And that was part of that compromise of having representatives apportioned by population. The North the South wanted all the slaves counted because it would give them more representatives. The North didn't want them all counted because it would mean the South would have more representatives than they had free white voting people. So that was another one of those compromises, to count slaves as 3/5 of a person. And then it goes on, the actual enumeration shall be made within 3 years after the first meeting of the Congress of the United States, which was 1789, and within every subsequent term of 10 years, in such manner as they shall be by law directed. So in other words, the Congress has the ability to direct the counting of the census, but a census is to be held every 10 years. And if we move to this next slide, so 1790, they were very quick to move and have the very first census in 1790, the year after the adoption of the Constitution. And so that's why we have census years every decade. That's why we're doing a census in 2020. And the Census Bureau is actually not formed as a separate sort of government agency until the 1930s. But this is a plaque off of the US Census Bureau. In 1790, of course, is the first American census. And they ask 6 basic questions. They want to know gender. They not only count the number of people, but they want to know gender. They want to know race, relationship to head of household, the name of the head of household, the number of slaves, if any. So it's a very simple census, very, very first census. But again, it begins to get some information about who we are as Americans. Now, this is the United States in 1790. The map is a little bit complicated, but what they did is they took a census, and I'm going to move my cursor around. I think, can you see my cursor? I'm moving it around on the map. Liz, okay, Michael,
Yep.
you can see it.
Yep.
Okay. What they did is the 13 states, but then the District of Kentucky. So this part of Virginia was actually a separate district and ultimately becomes the state of Kentucky. Maine up here is part of Massachusetts, ultimately breaks off and becomes a separate state of Massachusetts, of Maine, and separates from Massachusetts. Vermont is a district and ultimately becomes a separate state. And the Southwest district down here, which becomes the state of Tennessee. And then this area here, what becomes Alabama and Louisiana, the northern part of Alabama and Louisiana is claimed by Georgia, but also claimed by the United States. And this blue area down here is actually claimed jointly by Spain, which owns Florida, and the United States. And so there's some dispute over this territory, which is ultimately resolved and becomes the states of Alabama and Louisiana. The other thing I think is fascinating is this dotted line, and I'm moving my cursor along this dotted line that sort of zigzags up along, whoops, let me do that. There we go. Zigzags along here. This is what they call the frontier line. So that means beyond that line, to the west of that line, except for this little area right around here, is essentially undiscovered territory or unclaimed. It's claimed, but there's not enough residents in it to determine that it's not a frontier. So this is the idea of there's a frontier line in the 1790s. There's a line beyond which there's not significant settlement. And of course, that was Daniel Boone's sort of great trans-Appalachian journeys, is to open up this territory sort of west of the Appalachian Mountains and to extend the frontier. So what do we get in the first census? 3,893,635 people were counted. Now, these first two categories, they counted free white males over 16 and free white males under 16. So 807,791,000 males, and if you put those together, it's about 1.6 million white males, 1.541263 free white males, 59,150 other free persons. Those are the indentured servants, those who are serving a term of servitude. They've sold their services for a period of time. And then 694,280 slaves. So that's the very first American census and gives us a sense of who we were at that time, and a fairly close balance between men and women, but slightly more men than women. And sort of remember that when we talk about Vashon, because you're going to start seeing some differences of Vashon and the rest of the country. Now, I want to talk about Vashon census, and what you have here is at the very bottom, the website vashonhistory.com, where you can go and you can click on this link to the Vashon Island Census. This is the Vashon Census Project that we actually began in 2011. Alice Larson, who's pictured there on the right with the census sign for the 2010 census. And over on the left is Artemis Judd, after whom Judd Creek is named, who was one of the census takers in the 1890 census, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So you have a range of sort of censuses on Vashon. What we've done, if you go to that vashonhistory.com website to the Census Project, you'll see detailed information. We've digitized all the censuses up to 1940, So 1870 to 1892, you can look at all those censuses. And I'll talk about why 1892 is in there in just a second. 1900 to 1940, 1950 to 2010, then post-2010, which is community survey results. And then the research that we did, and Alice wrote up in a lot of detail. And then a couple charts and graphs that we'll look at in a few minutes. What's interesting about the US Census on Vashon is that, number one, the 1890 census has been destroyed. There's very little left of the 1890 census. It was burned in a fire. And so there's very little record anywhere in the United States from 1890. We're lucky on Vashon because there were a number of local, either state or county censuses done around 1890. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then up to 1940, all the census data is available. The Census Bureau keeps all census data confidential for 72 years. And the reason we started the census project in 2011, because in 2012, the 1940 census became available. And so we knew that that was going to come out. So we thought, well, why not go back and look at all the Vashon censuses? And what we did is we went in and we digitized them all, so you can go to this website. Rather than trying to read handwritten census data, you can actually see it typed out. And we did some accumulation of census data into these research in terms of occupations and gender differences, racial differences, all those kind of things. So it's a fascinating sort of research site. 1950 census will be available in 2022. So, and about almost a year and a half from now, we'll get the 1950 census, and we'll go back and do the same kind of thing with that. So just to give you a little bit background on where this information comes from. Oops, there we go. Oops, here we go. Now, Vashon census tracts. Essentially, early on, Vashon was broken into a number of census areas. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes with the 1920 census. But by the 1950 census, Vashon was divided into two census tracts. And interesting, that line begins, I'll move my cursor, that line begins at Ellisport, runs up to the high school, over just past the main highway, and then down to 220th, which runs over to Liza Beulah, which is close to where the Mason-Dixon line is. If you know about the Mason-Dixon line and that sort of division of North Vashon and South Vashon, and lots of sort of conflicts between the North and the South, and competition, particularly when there was a high school at Burton and a high school in Vashon, one representing the north end and the other representing the south end of the island. But what makes Vashon census unique in the United States is that the census boundaries of Vashon have not changed since the very first 1860 census on Vashon, where Vashon was not a separate area. It was counted as part of King County. But in 1870, you see Vashon as a separate counting area. And ever since then, Vashon is one of the few, if not the only, distinct geographical area in the United States that has not changed. The Census Bureau is always moving boundaries around. But Vashon, except for the fact that we have two separate census tracts, the water that surrounds us has defined us as a census entity since 1870. So it provides some very distinct kinds of research opportunities for understanding population on Vashon, where virtually nowhere else in the country can you do that, because areas are added and areas are subtracted to census districts all the time, but not on Vashon. So we sit in a very unique sort of place in terms of studying and understanding censuses. So Mason-Dixon line, important part of Vashon, also for censuses. Now, let me run you through a couple sort of just, I think, interesting things from the newspapers. This is from the 1920 Vashon News Record. And this is the census data, and I'm not sure you can read it very clearly, but Vashon had, whoops, let me go back. Vashon had 524 people, and Vashon census area was essentially Vashon town up toward the north end and down toward, but not including center. Burton was the area of Burton town and Quartermaster Harbor, Burton Peninsula, down toward Shawnee in that area. Cove over on the west side, Docton, just the town of Docton itself. And they all are close. Vashon's 524, Burton 421, Cove 387, Docton 388, Dauphin, which is the north end, so Dauphin Point, relatively small population in 1920, 176. Island District, which was essentially the south end, so sort of from Frog Hollow and the Tahlequah Y south, 68 people, so relatively small population. Maury was everything on Maury Island outside of Docton. Liza Beulah was the west side, south of Cove and north of where Camp South is in that area. And then Quartermaster was essentially from Judd Creek up to north of Center, so the center of the island, including Ellisport. So what you can see is that basically, heavy population in the center of the island, in Vashon and Burton, Cove, Docton, a separate community, relatively few people at the north end, very small population at the south end, Maury Island, fairly sparsely populated, the west side, fairly sparsely populated, and then a fairly dense population in the center of the island between Burton and Vashon. So just an interesting sort of way to see how the island looked in 1920. And it probably hasn't changed very much since then. These relationships, I think, are pretty much still similar. Now, this is from 1940. This is Agnes Smock was editor of the News Record. Mike Suddeth is her grandson. And she was an interesting character. In 1940, she had an editorial in the Vashon News Record about protesting the census. And she entitled it, "When the Census Taker Comes." She said, "It is unavoidable that on Vashon Maury Island, there are a certain number of conscientious objectors to answering some of the very personal questions which would be asked this month by neighbors taking the federal census." She goes on to talk about wanting to know how old you are, wanting to know how much money you have, wanting to know what your job is. I mean, all those kind of things that she considered personal and she didn't want to share. And she goes on and says, "We believe that the psychological back of this general protest, the psychology back of this general protest is a lurking fear of what has been happening in other countries when citizens become indexed. The very spirit of America revolts against that sort of record of those things we consider our own business." Now, this is written in 1940. This is written when Nazi Germany is beginning to round up Jews and protesters and homosexuals. And that's not known widely, but Agnes Scott, as a newspaper woman, would have certainly known that. And so there's sort of two things about her protest. One is all this personal information, but then also what happens when government knows who you are and where you are. And in 1940, you can consider that might be a concern. So the next thing, this is the census page from the 1940 census. And if you look down here where my cursor is, there scratched out is the name Smock. And nobody was recorded because she refused to answer the census questions. So kind of a fascinating little look into Vashon exceptionalism and Vashon orneriness, if you will. In 1950, after the census was taken, The boosters on the island were very upset that the numbers were not as high as they thought they would be. Now, you got to remember, this is a time right after the big ferry strikes of the late 1940s. Vashon has just had its own Vashon Ferry District. And when the Washington Ferry District is created in 1951, the ferry system is created in 1951, the idea is that the ferry system is going to disappear within a few years and be replaced by bridges. And so Vashon boosters at the time are very concerned that the population was undercounted on Vashon because they wouldn't get as much support for a bridge to the mainland. And most business people and most islanders, in fact, at the time, were very supportive of having a bridge. This was a time of post-war growth, the beginning of the baby boom. And so in the news record, there's this protest. It just isn't so. But then that is the population figure given to us today as compiled by the 1950 census. We hope that an era can be found that will bring the number of our residents up to the figures so often quoted. So they often thought that there were 5,000 to 6,000 people on the island at the time. But as you'll see in a few minutes when we look at the census data, not so. And then in 1960, some of the concerns was, well, how many summer residents? And it's a question many of us still have today. And it's an issue that's very hard to get at, is how many summer residents are there on the island? And as a result of the 1960 census, there was some look at how many properties on Vashon are unoccupied in the spring when the census count was taken. And 30.4% of houses on Vashon were unoccupied in the 1960 census. And then they talk about the island has 2,421 units, 738 were vacant at the time of the enumeration. That's the highest in King County. And so they extrapolate from that, and that's where they estimate as many as 2,000 summer residents were on Vashon. It's kind of a backdoor way to do it, but at the same time, we've never been able to get an accurate count of how many summer people come on to Vashon and live here during the summer and then live somewhere else during the winter. So something for us to think about. Now, let's talk about population trends on Vashon. So this is a graph in which you notice after between 1880 and 1900. So down here, there's a number of dots in there, and that's because the 1890 census was lost. And so what we did is we went in and we found state and county censuses that were done in that period around 1890, and we put that data into this chart, and you'll see that in a minute. But what this does is let you look at the general pattern. So there's a big growth spurt here. There's a leveling off here from the 1910 to 1940 census. There's steady growth from 1950 into 1960, 70, a slowdown in the 1970s as a result of the Boeing bust. Whoops, let me go back. Whoops, if we can go back. It's getting out of control. I'm sorry, guys. Yep. Slowing down in the 1980s because 1970 to 80 because of the Boeing bust. Very rapid growth after 1980, probably because of the introduction of new ferries and the passenger-only ferry. And then a slowing down of the curve, sort of what we hope to see with coronavirus over the next few weeks. The curve starts to flatten out. And I'll talk about that in a minute as well. So let me move on to, this is actually the census data itself. So what you can see is you've got over on the left-hand side the chart, but then you have a list of the censuses from 1880, and then 1885, 1887, 1889, 1892. Those are all local county or state censuses that we used to try and extrapolate into what would have been happening in the 1890 census. And then 1900, 1910, 2030, up to 2000. And if you look at this, there's some interesting kind of things going on. One, I mean, the rapid sort of growth that takes place from 1880, arrival of the railroad in the late 1870s into Tacoma. Whoops, I'm sorry. Sorry, guys. So slow population growth, initial relatively quick growth into the 1880s. Then it slows down into the 1890s with the Depression of 1892-3. What you get is very little growth in the 1890s. A lot of people are leaving Vashon. But then from 1900, we have 944 people, to 1910, we have 2,400 people. That's a huge growth rate. So 150%, 57% growth rate. That's the largest single growth rate on Vashon, except for that very first census years when we went from 100 to 300 people. But when you go from 900 to 2,500 people, that's a significant sort of growth for Vashon. And that continues into 1920 with the 16% growth, which is a pretty good growth rate. But then you'll notice in 1930, it actually declines. So between 1920 and 1930, there's actually a decline in population on Vashon. And that's a result of two things going on. One, the end of what Carlos Schwantes called the wage worker frontier. So in the 1890s and 1910s, there were a lot of young men on the island working in resource extraction industries, agriculture, logging, farming, mining, brick making, a variety of things. As those industries begin to die out and begin to change, those young men move on to new frontiers, to Alaska and to other places. And so basically Vashon in the 1920s is in a depression, an agricultural depression that's nationwide, and it affects population growth on Vashon. And so we see an actual decline between 1920 and 1930. During the Great Depression, by the end of the Great Depression in 1940, population is starting to grow again because the Puget Sound is starting to mobilize for World War II, and there's lots of new jobs. And you look at the number of people fleeing the Dust Bowl in the center of the country, and where do they flee? They flee to the coast, and many come to California, Oregon, and Washington. So what you see toward the end of the 1930s is a growth that is reflected in the 1940 population. Then the growth in 1950, which is 25% growth, which is a big growth rate, even though at the time people thought it was growing faster than that. And then a 33% growth rate in between 1950 and 1960, and a 26% growth rate between 1960 and 1970. What's happening during these decades? That's the baby boom. Lots and lots of young people on the island. The population is growing rapidly. Plus, Vashon's becoming a sort of a bedroom community for Seattle. It's becoming a commuter community. And that's bringing more and more people onto the island. So an increased birth rate, an increased job opportunities in Puget Sound, and those wanting to live in a rural area but close to a city drives a big population growth. I mean, it almost doubles between 1940 and 1970. You look at that, it's a huge growth rate that takes place during that time. And then in 1980, it actually slows. And this is, I think, largely between 1970 and 1980, that slower growth rate, 13%, which is still a fairly sizable growth rate, slows largely because of the Boeing bust in the 70s that slows down economic opportunities in the Puget Sound region. Between 1980 and 1990, grows back at the rates it was growing in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, 26% growth rate. And I think, personally, that's largely the influence of increased ferry capacity that's brought on with new ferries and the opening of the passenger-only ferry at the north end going directly to downtown Seattle. From 1990 to 2000, the growth rate begins to slow, And then in 2010, it's beginning to slow further. And I'll come back and talk in just a few minutes about the 2020 census. I think it's going to be slowing even more than that. So that gives you a good sort of overview of, whoops, there we go, of what has happened on Vashon. Now let me look at what's happening in this decade. And part of the problem with this decade is that we don't have census data until the 2020 census will be available sometime later this year or early next year, if it's even available. I mean, because of the coronavirus pandemic, the census process is being disrupted. And so census day was April 1st. Whether or not we're going to get response rates, it's just hard to know. What the Census Bureau has been doing since 2010 is essentially every year doing what they call a community survey. And they come in and they survey around 400, 450 islanders and extrapolate from that what's happening with population, with jobs, with racial diversity, those kind of things. And you can see from this list, 2011, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 is starting to drop a little bit, 17, 18 is up a little bit. My projection, and this is based off of relatively incomplete data, but I suspect we'll see something around a 3% growth rate in the 2020 census. It could be more than that, could be less, I'm not positive, but I would think that given the trends, given what's happening on Vashon, that we'll probably see slightly under 11,000 people in the 2020 census. And then let me just talk briefly about what's happening on Vashon. What do we know about Vashon? What's happening in general? And when you look back at the last 20, 30 years on Vashon, the growth rate is slowing. The curve is starting to sort of level off. Household size is decreasing. We have smaller families, more retired adults with no children, more single sex households on the island, many without children, some with children. But in a sense, the households on Vashon are decreasing. Also, the female to male ratio is increasing. More and more females on the island, fewer and fewer males. Right now it's 48, 52%. Female, 52%, male, 48%. I suspect that will continue to increase as females are living longer, males are dying younger, as we just see the demographics of Vashon shifting. I think that ratio, not only on Vashon, but nationally, that gap is going to continue to occur. People of color in the population, even at the height of the Japanese presence on Vashon in the 1930s, there were only about 4 to 5% of people of color on Vashon. In the 2010 census, that's up to about 8%, a little bit more than 8%. My suspicion is that that's going to increase even more in the 2020 census. Much more diverse populations moving on to Vashon. It's still predominantly a white community, but it's a white community that's beginning to see more diversity coming in. The Latino population, by 2010, it was up to 4.1% of the population. It's the fastest growing group in the United States, demographic group, and I think you're going to see that on Vashon as well. I wouldn't be surprised to see that go up to 6 to 7, maybe even 8% during the decade from 2010 to 2020. Home ownership is increasing, 80% home ownership in the 2010 census. I think that's probably continuing to increase, which means that there's fewer rentals, there's fewer sort of properties that aren't primary homes on the island. Although it'll be interesting to see if we get it in the 2020 census data, what's happened with VRBOs and B&Bs and those kind of things. The 65-year-old population is increasing dramatically, 18% in the 2010 census. And I think that could be well near 20% or over 20% by the 2020 census. And then median income is increasing. So Vashon is becoming wealthier, it's becoming older, it's becoming a little bit more diverse, but still not significant. I mean, it's still under 25% of the population is either Latino or people of color, and it's becoming increasingly female. So just an interesting way to look at what's happening on Vashon. And what I will be interested in is coming back to you in about a year and a half, once we have the 2020 census data, and look at this and see what's actually has happened. So just to end this, couple sort of things. I talked about this earlier. The census data is confidential for 72 years. So in 2022, we'll see the 1950 census and be able to do some more detailed research like we've done on all the censuses up to 1940. We'll be able to do that for 1950. If you haven't already completed your 2020 census form, do. For those of you who have, it's a very simple form. It basically wants to know your age, your race, and your gender, and that's about it. They're doing more detailed, sort of selective canvassing, but what we're not going to get is the kind of thing that we got in the 2020 census and all the censuses before there, where you had a lot of detailed information on Vashon populations. So if you're a sort of data nerd like I am, and you want to know what's happening on Vashon, let your representative, let your senators know that what we want in the census is a long form. We want all that data collected so that we can tell what's happening on the island, not in terms of just numbers and not in terms of just race and gender, but also in terms of occupation, in terms of income levels, in terms of all those other kinds of things that are collected in the census. So that's something you can do to help make sure that when I come back to you in 2030, that we'll have more complete sort of information on Vashon. So I just want to take an opportunity here to thank the Vashon Senior Center, Vashon Heritage Museum for trying this, seeing how it works. And from my perspective, it's worked okay. Liz, what do you think?
Oh, this is so exciting, Bruce. Both the form and the content have just been stellar, I think. And I have a few questions, though, that people brought up in case you'd be up for a few more minutes.
More than happy to.
Okay, great. So we had a question early on about your comment about the census in early Iceland, and the questioner wanted to know, how did you know there was one farm excluded?
That's what the records of that census talk about. They counted every farm except one, so that's where that comes from. So they recognize they missed one farm. And I don't know if they recognized that after they had published the census data they had, because they published it in a little publication. And that's available online. You can actually go in and Google Iceland census of 1703 or whatever it was. It's fascinating sort of information. Yep. So yeah, that's how I knew about it.
Excellent. So, and another general question. So, is census data generally digitalized for different areas? And I assume the American census is, but are there census records from other countries as well?
Yes, yeah. Most countries do censuses of some sort. It's how we get world population figures. The UN basically taps into all those various country censuses. Essentially, I mean, it's done very differently in different areas. The United States Census has, up until 2010, when they reduced the amount of categories they enumerated, and then in the 2020 census, they've basically gutted sort of most of what demographers look for in the census data. And I think that's highly unfortunate, because we're not going to be able, researchers like me who look at the 1950 census, and we're just waiting for it to come out so we get a good picture of Vashon in 1950. They're not going to have that for 2020, and I think that's a shame. It's really sad that we're not going to have that. That future historians and future researchers are not going to have that resource available. So yeah, but yeah, the question about what are censuses around the world? They're varied from country to country. Almost every country does some kind of census. And the United States Census, up until recently, has been sort of a world leader in comprehensive census data, and it's available. I mean, as soon as the census is tabulated, so by early next year, the Census Bureau will start putting out data at community, state, and national levels, and you'll begin to be able to see at least the results of what they've gotten in the census.
Great. And are censuses from other areas also digitalized?
No, that's something we did here on Vashon. A few communities have gone in and digitized their census data, but most have not. Most you can through Ancestry.com, through the National Archives, you can go look at those census forms from earlier census, from 1940 earlier. You can look at any census records, but it's all handwritten. And therefore, it's hard to when it's not digitized, it's very hard to sort of accumulate it into categories. When we digitize Vashon census data, now we're able to go in and we're able to look at, say, how many carpenters have there been on Vashon every decade from 1870 to 1940. We won't have that data until 2022 for 1950. But when we do get it, we'll dump it in there, we'll digitize it, and we'll just add it to that database.
Great. So Keith has been passing notes while you were speaking, and as you can imagine, and one of the things he did point out that the 2020 census has done an intensive attempt to reach undercounted populations, particularly homeless and others. I don't. Do you want to speak to that?
Well, yeah. I mean, that's always been the problem with censuses, and early on in the American censuses. Well, this was 50 years ago. I was doing some research on censuses in San Antonio, Texas, and Santa Fe, New Mexico, and the census takers were the sheriffs. And so you can imagine, people who didn't want to be on the sheriff's radar when they saw him coming walking up as a census taker, they just sort of disappear. So one of the problems of census is always undercounts, particularly undercounts of vulnerable populations, homeless populations, minority populations. Immigrant populations have always been undercounted in census. And a lot of that goes back to originally census takers were either sheriffs or government officials. And then gradually by the 20th century, they begin to recruit enumerators to come in. But again, they're people from the community and often community leaders. And so, bam, there's a sort of automatic undercounting, if you will.
Excellent. So do we have any other questions that people would like to have answered? It looks like we've come to the end of our time. We had allocated an hour for this presentation. I'm interested in feedback on how your experience was and how we can do better. Any topics you'd like to see us try to cover? And I guess we'll all be meeting this way for another month. And but we do want to keep the great content coming from the Historical Society, and the Senior Center definitely wants to keep in touch with all of our members, and I hope you'll communicate with us if you have any needs. In fact, I'm going to put Kathleen's email on here in case you want to get a hold of her. For any reason. She's there Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or accessible any Monday, Wednesday, Friday if you have needs or know somebody who could probably use a reach out to someone in the community. So Bruce, you have a last word?
So I want to thank everybody. I want to thank the Senior Center. I want to thank the museum, and hopefully that this will meet some of the needs that we have, and that people want this kind of thing during the time that we're all sort of sequestered away in our stay-at-home sort of stance that we're in right now. So thank you, Liz. Thank you to the Senior Center, and thank you to the Heritage Museum.
And thank you all for braving this new world of Zoom and getting yourselves online. Please go and share the technology with someone you love, and hope to see you here again next time. I'm going to leave the chat open for just a minute or two, and we will definitely capture that chat and respond to any things that you point out that we need to do better. So get out and see that sunshine, and I hope all of you enjoy a great day. Thank you for tuning in.